the old woman was dying alone in a mansion full of people. Rain hammered the tall windows of the Khan estate on the hill above Incheon, and inside, nurses in crisp white uniforms hurried past her door like she was furniture nobody remembered buying. Somewhere below, a chandelier the size of a car threw gold light across marble floors, and somewhere further still, in an office lined with black leather and cold steel, her son counted money that could have bought her medicine 10 times over. Nobody had checked on her in 6 hours. Nobody would check on her for 6 more. And then the door creaked open, and a woman who did not belong to this family, who had been hired only 3 days earlier to fold towels and empty trash bins, walked in holding a bowl of warm porridge she had made with her own hands, because she'd noticed the old woman hadn't eaten since morning. Her name was Amara Johnson, and she had no idea that in the next hour, everything about this house, its secrets, its silence, its cruelty, was about to change forever. If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, hit subscribe right now, because what happens next will stay with you long after this video ends. Comment "I'm watching" if you're ready for the whole story, from the very beginning. 3 weeks earlier, Amara had been sitting in a cramped studio apartment in Seoul's Itaewon district, staring at a stack of unpaid bills and a visa that was about to expire. She was 28 years old, born in Lagos, raised partly in Houston, and she had come to South Korea 2 years ago chasing a nursing contract that fell through before she'd even unpacked her second suitcase. Since then she had cleaned hotel rooms, waited tables, translated documents for expats who paid her half of what they promised, and watched her savings shrink to almost nothing. She had a mother back in Houston with high blood pressure and a little brother finishing high school, and every month she wired home whatever she could, even when it meant she skipped dinner 3 nights a week. The job posting had appeared almost like a joke. Live-in caregiver and household staff needed, Kong residence, Incheon, generous pay, immediate start. She almost didn't apply, the Kong name made her stomach tighten. Everyone in Seoul's underground economy knew that name. Kong Taemin ran shipping routes that moved things nobody wanted moved through customs, and men who crossed him disappeared quietly, without funerals. But Amara had $90 in her account and a landlord who had already knocked twice that week. She applied anyway. The interview lasted 4 minutes. A sharp-suited woman named Ms. Yi Jean, the estate manager, looked her up and down like she was inspecting a used appliance, asked if she had any family in Korea who would come looking for her, and when Amara said no, nodded like that was the correct answer. "You'll care for the boss's mother," Yi Jean said flatly. "She's difficult. The last 3 girls quit within a week. You get 1 week's trial. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't ask questions, and don't ever look Mr. Kong directly in the eye." Amara had swallowed the warning like medicine and taken the job anyway, because $90 doesn't buy groceries and dignity at the same time. The mansion swallowed her whole the moment she walked in. Marble corridors stretched longer than her entire old apartment. Portraits of stern men in dark suits lined the walls, watching her like she'd already done something wrong. The staff moved through the halls with their heads down, whispering instead of talking, and every single one of them avoided the East Wing, where, she was told, the old madam lived and where nobody wants to go. Nobody wants to go. She would learn exactly why on her very first night. She found the old woman's room at the end of a hallway so quiet it felt abandoned, behind a door nobody had oiled in what sounded like years. Inside, the air was stale, curtains drawn tight against the daylight, and in a bed too large for her shrinking frame lay Kang Soon-ja, 79 years old, once the fierce matriarch who had built half of this family's empire with her bare hands before illness folded her into something small and forgotten. Her silver hair was matted. Her water glass on the nightstand was empty and had clearly been empty for a long time. When Amara knelt beside the bed and gently said hello, the old woman flinched like she expected to be struck. "You're new," Soon-ja rasped in Korean, then, seeing the confusion on Amara's face, switched with surprising fluency into broken but clear English. "They send someone new every week. Don't waste your kindness on me, girl." I'm already a ghost in this house. You're not a ghost to me, Amara said quietly. I just got here. Let me get you some water. She expected the old woman to wave her off the way the staff had warned her she would. Instead, Sunja's eyes filled with tears. She seemed almost embarrassed to be shedding, and she whispered something that would echo in Amara's mind for weeks afterward. Nobody has looked at me like a person in 3 years. That first night, Amara washed Sunja's hair with warm water. She'd heated herself because the room's water heater had been broken for months and nobody had bothered to report it. She found clean sheets in a linen closet nobody used anymore, changed the bedding, and sat with the old woman until nearly 2 in the morning, listening to fragments of a life story that came out in pieces between labored breaths, a husband long dead, a son who used to climb into her lap as a boy and now couldn't spare 15 minutes for her, a daughter-in-law who visited only when cameras were watching, grandchildren who'd been taught to see her as an inconvenience wrapped in old skin. By the time Amara finally left the room, something had shifted in her chest that she couldn't quite name. She told herself it was pity. It would take longer than she expected to understand. It was something closer to purpose. If you felt that ache too, drop a like on this video right now, because the story is only getting started, and what this family did to this dying woman is about to break your heart wide open. The days that followed fell into a rhythm nobody in the house seemed to notice or care about. Amara woke before dawn to prepare warm meals soft enough for Sunja's weakening throat, spooned porridge into her mouth when her hands trembled too badly to hold a spoon, read her old Korean poetry books aloud even though her pronunciation made the old woman laugh until she coughed, and sat beside her bed at night just so she wouldn't have to face the dark alone. She learned that Sunja had been diagnosed 8 months earlier with a fast-moving cancer that had already spread beyond what doctors could reverse, and that despite the family's obscene wealth, nobody had bothered to move her into a proper care facility, hire a real medical team, or even update her prescriptions on schedule. It was cheaper, apparently, to let her fade quietly in a back wing of the house than to deal with the inconvenience of her dying in public. Amara discovered this not from Sunja, who never complained, but from overhearing a conversation she was never meant to hear. She had gone to the kitchen late one night for tea when she heard Yi Jin's voice through the cracked door of the study, low and businesslike, speaking to someone on the phone. The doctors say 2 months, maybe 3 if we're unlucky, Yi Jin said. The lawyers are already drafting the transfer of her shares to Taemin. No, she doesn't need to know the details. She signs whatever we put in front of her these days. She barely remembers what year it is half the time. Amara's stomach turned to ice. She backed away from the door before she could hear more, her tea forgotten, her hands shaking. She told herself it wasn't her business. She was a hired maid, a temporary body filling a temporary room, and in this house, opinions from people like her were not welcome, let alone acted upon. But that night, when she returned to Sunja's room and found the old woman awake, staring at the ceiling with tears sliding silently into her pillow, Amara couldn't stay silent anymore. They're planning something, aren't they? Sunja whispered without being asked. I heard Yi Jin on the phone the other day too. I may be dying, child, but I am not stupid. I built this family's fortune with these 2 hands before any of them were even born, and now they can't wait to fold me into a signature on a piece of paper. Then don't sign anything, Amara said fiercely, surprising herself with how much force came out of her voice. Not until you understand exactly what it says. I'll read every page to you myself if I have to. Sunja looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her tired eyes. Why do you care what happens to an old woman you barely know? Amara thought about her own mother back in Houston, about the years her mother had worked double shifts so Amara could finish school, about how frightening it was to imagine anyone treating that woman the way this family treated Sunja. Because somewhere, I have a mother too, she said simply. And I'd want somebody to care for her the way nobody in this house cares for you. It was the first time in 3 years that Sunja smiled without it looking like it cost her something. That was the night everything began to change, though neither of them yet knew how far the ripples would spread, or that the man whose approval this entire household trembled for was about to walk in on a scene that would shatter every assumption he'd built his cold, guarded life around. Kang Tae-man had not visited his mother's room in 11 days. He told himself it was because of the shipment crisis in Busan, the negotiations with the Osaka syndicate that had gone sideways, the 3 separate fires he was putting out across 4 cities that kept him behind his desk until sunrise most mornings. The truth, buried somewhere he refused to dig, was that he could not stand to see what illness had done to the woman who once seemed unbreakable to him. He remembered her as she'd been when he was a boy, sharp-eyed, quick-tempered, terrifyingly capable, a woman who had clawed a shipping empire out of nothing after his father's death left her a widow with 3 creditors circling like wolves. He did not know how to reconcile that memory with the frail figure fading in the East Wing, and so, coward that he refused to admit he simply stayed away. It was pure accident that brought him to her door that night. He'd come home past midnight, intending only to grab a folder from his study, when he heard laughter drifting down the east hallway, real laughter, warm and unguarded, the kind that hadn't echoed through this house in years. He followed the sound before he'd consciously decided to, and stopped in the doorway of his mother's room to a sight that stopped his heart cold. His mother was sitting up in freshly changed sheets, color in her cheeks he hadn't seen in months, laughing at something the maid beside her bed had just said in badly accented Korean. The room smelled of ginger tea instead of sickness. The curtains were open, moonlight pouring in instead of the perpetual dark the staff kept it in. And his mother who hadn't smiled at anyone in this house in longer than he could remember, was gripping this stranger's hand like it was a lifeline. "Who are you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous in the way that made grown men in his organization go pale. "And what are you doing in my mother's room at this hour?" Amara rose immediately, every instinct in her body screaming to apologize, to shrink, to disappear the way Yi-jin had warned her to around this man. But something in her, the same something that had made her stand up to a room full of men twice her size back in Houston when they tried to shortchange her mother's church for catering work, kept her spine straight. "My name is Amara," she said evenly. "I'm your mother's caregiver. It's midnight, and she was in pain and couldn't sleep, so I made her tea and we were talking. That's all. Nobody told me my mother had a new caregiver." "Nobody tells you much of anything about your mother these days, do they?" Soonja said quietly from the bed, and the words landed on her son like a slap. Taemin's jaw tightened. He looked between the 2 women, the accusation in his mother's voice, the unflinching calm in the stranger's eyes, and something he hadn't felt in a very long time, shame, crawled up the back of his neck. He was a man other men feared, a man who had ordered things done that would keep a normal person awake for the rest of their life, and yet standing in this doorway, he felt smaller than he had since he was a boy hiding from his father's temper. "Leave us," he said to Amara, though the fire had gone out of his voice. "With respect, sir," Amara said, "your mother's fever is only just breaking. I'd rather not leave her side until it does." Nobody spoke to Kang Tae-man that way. Yi-jin would have fired her on the spot for the tone alone. But he found himself, against every instinct honed over 15 years of ruling through fear, simply nodding and stepping back to let her finish adjusting his mother's blankets, watching this stranger care for the one person in the world he had never learned how to protect. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with a glass of untouched whiskey, replaying the scene over and over, his mother's laughter, the stranger's steady hands, the humiliating truth that a maid he'd never met had done more for his dying mother in a handful of days than his entire household had managed in months. By morning, he had made 2 decisions. The first was that Amara Johnson was not going anywhere. The second, one he did not yet fully understand himself, was that he needed to know everything about the woman who had somehow cracked open a door in his mother's heart that had been sealed shut for years. If this is the moment you started rooting for both of them, comment Team Amara below, because what this family does next, when they realize a maid is standing in the way of their inheritance, is about to get very, very dangerous. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Amara's life. Overnight, her position in the household transformed. Where staff had once ignored her, they now watched her with a mixture of suspicion and fear, whispering behind hands whenever she passed. Yi Jin, who had barely acknowledged her existence before, began appearing in Sunja's doorway with thin, forced smiles and pointed questions about what, exactly, Amara and the old woman discussed during their long nights together. And Taemin, cold, guarded, terrifying Taemin, a man whose name alone made grown businessmen sweat through their suits, began finding excuses to walk past his mother's room in the evenings, lingering in doorways, asking after his mother's condition in a voice that had lost some of its usual iron. Sunja noticed before Amara did. "He's falling for you," the old woman said one evening, an impish glint in her tired eyes as Amara adjusted her foreline. "My son. Watch how he finds a reason to walk this hallway every single night now, when he used to avoid it for weeks." "He's checking on his mother," Amara said, refusing to let herself hope for anything more, because hope was a dangerous, expensive thing for a woman with a fragile visa and a family depending on her paycheck. "He's checking on you," Sunja corrected, and laughed at the way Amara's cheeks warmed despite herself. But there was little room for romance in a house that had begun closing ranks against her. It started small, meals mysteriously delayed, medical supplies she requested taking days instead of hours to arrive, her paycheck shorted twice in a row with vague excuses from the accounting office. Then it escalated. She overheard two of the senior staff members openly discussing whether the gold-digging foreign maid was manipulating the old woman for a payout before she died, poisoning Sunja's mind against her own family. Amara said nothing, kept her head down, and kept caring for the woman who had become, in the strangest of circumstances, something like a second mother to her, but the whispers grew louder, and eventually reached the one person capable of turning whispers into real danger. Taemin's younger sister, Kang Ji-sun, had been circling the estate for weeks like a shark sending blood and water, her every visit calculated to keep tabs on the mother whose signature she needed on the shareholder transfer documents before the quarter closed. When she learned that a nameless foreign maid had somehow convinced Sunja to delay signing anything at all, that the old woman was now demanding her lawyer read every clause aloud before she'd put pen to paper, Ji-sun's calm shattered. She confronted Amara in the hallway outside Sunja's room, flanked by two of the household security staff, her voice a knife wrapped in silk. "You think you're clever," she hissed, worming your way into a dying old woman's affections, turning her against her own blood. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with in this family? Pack your things tonight, or I will have you removed from this country so fast you won't have time to say goodbye to whoever's waiting for you back wherever you came from." Amara's heart hammered, fear tightening around her throat like a fist, but she thought of her mother's voice, calm and unshakable even during the hardest years, telling her as a child, "You don't back down from bullies, baby. You just make sure you're standing on the truth when you don't." "I haven't turned her against anyone," Amara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've simply cared for her the way a human being deserves to be cared for. If that threatens your plans, that's not something I did to your family. That's something your family did to itself, long before I ever walked through that door." Ji-sun's face twisted with fury, and for one terrifying second, Amara genuinely believed she was about to be dragged bodily from the house. But before either security guard could move, a voice cut through the hallway like a blade. "Touch her," Taemin said from the top of the staircase, his voice quiet in the way that made the security guards freeze mid-step, "and you will regret it for the rest of your life, Ji-sun. I don't care whose sister you are." The hallway went utterly silent. Ji-sun stared up at her brother, disbelief and betrayal warring across her face. "You're choosing a maid over your own family?" "I'm choosing the only person in this house," Taemin said, descending the stairs slowly, his eyes never leaving Amara's, "who has treated our mother like she's still a person instead of a line item on an inheritance spreadsheet. If that makes me the villain in your story, so be it. If your heart just skipped a beat, you are not alone. Smash that like button, because everything this family has hidden is about to come crashing into the light, and it's bigger than anyone in that hallway could have imagined." That confrontation should have ended the whispers. Instead, it lit a fuse. Within days, Yi Jin, who Amara would later learn had been quietly siphoning funds from Sunja's personal accounts for over a year under the cover of medical expenses, realized that a caregiver with Taemin's growing trust posed a direct threat to a scheme that had been running for far longer than anyone suspected. If Amara kept reading every document line by line to Sunja before she signed, the falsified expense reports, the forged authorizations, the slow bleeding of the old woman's private wealth into accounts that led back to Yi Jin and, disturbingly, to Ji-sun herself, would eventually surface. So Yi Jin did what desperate people running out of options do. She lied. She went to Taemin with a folder of doctored security footage timestamps and a fabricated story that Amara had been overheard on a phone call discussing selling details about the family's private affairs to a tabloid reporter for cash, the kind of betrayal that, in Taemin's world, was answered with consequences far more severe than simple dismissal. She knew exactly which fear to weaponize. A man who trusted no one, being told the one person he'd let close in years had been playing him the entire time. Taemin confronted Amara that night in the East Wing hallway, his face a mask of barely restrained fury, the folder trembling slightly in his grip. "Tell me it isn't true," he said, his voice raw in a way she'd never heard from him before. "Tell me you haven't been talking to reporters about my mother, about this family, while sitting at her bedside every night pretending to care." Amara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "I would never, Taemin. I don't even know any reporters." "Whoever told you that is lying to you. Yi Jin has proof." "Yi Jin has been stealing from your mother for over a year," Amara said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, months of careful silence finally breaking. "I've seen the receipts she brings your mother to sign. Medical supplies that were never delivered, invoices for equipment that doesn't exist in this house. I didn't say anything because I thought it wasn't my place, and I was afraid nobody would believe me over her. But ask yourself, Taemin. Who has more reason to want me gone right now? Me, a maid with nothing to gain from destroying a family I barely know, or the woman who's been bleeding your mother's accounts dry and just watched me convince her to finally start reading the fine print?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that Amara could hear her own heartbeat. Taemin stared at her, the folder still clutched in his fist, a lifetime of trained suspicion warring against something softer he'd only recently allowed himself to feel. Then, slowly, he lowered the folder. "Show me," he said. "Show me everything you've seen." That night, sitting at the kitchen table with bank statements Sunja had quietly saved and hidden beneath her mattress for months, because some deep, stubborn part of the old matriarch had never fully trusted the people circling her bed, Amara laid out 18 months of fraud in careful, methodical detail. Falsified invoices. Withdrawals disguised as medical costs. A private account in the Cayman Islands that traced back, through 3 shell companies, directly to Yi Jin and, buried one layer deeper, to Ji-sun's own signature. Taemin sat in silence for a long time after Amara finished, his hands pressed flat against the table, his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the coldness the rest of the world knew him for. "My mother built this entire family from nothing," he said quietly. "She survived things that would have broken anyone else. And the people closest to her turned her dying days into a business opportunity." He looked up at Amara, something raw and unguarded in his eyes. "You could have taken that folder tonight and let me believe you were the enemy. You could have run and saved yourself the trouble of a family that never wanted you here in the first place. Why didn't you?" Amara thought of her own mother, of every lesson learned scrubbing floors and folding towels and standing her ground in rooms that made it clear she didn't belong. "Because your mother looked at me on my very first night here and told me nobody had treated her like a person in 3 years, she said softly. "I couldn't walk away from that. Not for a paycheck, and not for my own safety. If you're not crying yet, just wait, because what happens in the next 24 hours will change this entire family forever, and it starts with a confession nobody in that house ever expected to hear." Before any of that could happen, the house had one more test to throw at her. 2 nights after Taemin asked to see the evidence, Amara returned to her small staff quarters to find her room torn apart, mattress overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor, her few photographs from home scattered in one of them, a picture of her mother and brother outside their Houston church, deliberately torn down the middle. There was no note, no confession, but she didn't need one. She sat on the floor amid the wreckage for a long time before she found the strength to clean it up, telling herself this was exactly the kind of message meant to send her running before morning. She almost did run. She got as far as the bus station in Incheon, suitcase in hand, ticket already purchased for the airport shuttle, before her phone buzzed with a text from Soonja's private nurse. "She's asking for you, she won't settle without you here." Amara stood on that platform for what felt like an hour, torn between the safety of leaving and the pull of a promise she'd made to a dying woman who had nobody else willing to fight for her. In the end, it wasn't bravery that turned her around. It was the memory of her own mother's voice, telling her that running from a fight you believe in only feels safer until you have to live with having run. She walked back into that house at 2 in the morning, past a security guard who refused to meet her eyes, straight to Soonja's room, where the old woman was sitting up, pale and frightened, clutching a rosary Amara had never seen her use before. "I thought you left me," Soonja whispered. "I almost did," Amara admitted, sitting beside the bed and taking the old woman's trembling hand in both of hers. "But I made you a promise, and promises are the one thing this family hasn't managed to take from me yet." It was that same night, exhausted and shaken but resolute, that Amara finally told Taemin about the ransacked room. His reaction was immediate and terrifying in its precision, security footage pulled within the hour, staff schedules cross-referenced, and by sunrise he had narrowed the list of suspects to 3 names, all of them close to Yee-jin. He didn't raise his voice once during the entire investigation, which somehow made it more frightening than if he had. "In my world," he told Amara quietly afterward, "silence before action is far more dangerous than shouting. You'll understand soon enough that I don't make threats. I simply make sure people understand consequences before they happen." Confronting Yee-jin should have been simple with the evidence in hand, but Yee-jin, cornered and desperate, played her final card with vicious precision. She threatened to go to the police with a fabricated story claiming Amara had assaulted her, backed by 2 bribed security guards willing to lie under oath for a cut of what remained in the stolen accounts. In a country where Amara's visa status hung by a thread and where the con name carried enough weight to make local law enforcement move however money directed them to move, the threat was not empty. One phone call could have Amara deported within 72 hours, her mother's medical bills back in Houston unpaid, her little brother's tuition fund gone, everything she'd fought for in this country erased over a lie. Amara felt the ground crumbling beneath her for the first time since she'd arrived in that house. She sat by Soonja's bedside that night, exhausted, frightened, quietly beginning to pack her few belongings into the same worn suitcase she'd arrived with, telling herself it was safer to leave before Yee-jin's threats became real. Soonja, weaker now than she'd been in weeks, watched her with sharp, knowing eyes. "You're running," the old woman said. "I'm protecting myself," Amara said, voice cracking despite her effort to stay composed. "I can't fight a family with this much money and this much power, Halmoni. I have nothing to fight back with except the truth, and the truth doesn't always win against people like Yee-jin." Soonja reached out with trembling fingers and gripped Amara's wrist with a strength that seemed impossible for a body so frail. "Listen to me," she said, her voice suddenly fierce, cutting through decades of illness and grief like the woman she had been 40 years ago, clawing an empire out of nothing with nothing but her own 2 hands. "I did not survive burying a husband, raising 2 children alone, and building a shipping empire from a single rusted boat by running from people who thought they had more power than me. You will not run from this house tonight. You will stay, and you will let me finish what I started the day you walked into this room." That was the moment Soonja called for her lawyer, not Yee-jin's lawyer, not the family's usual legal team compromised by decades of loyalty to whoever signed the checks, but a private attorney she had quietly retained months earlier, the moment she first suspected something was wrong with her accounts. Within hours, and with Taemin standing at her side for the first time in this entire ordeal, Sunja recorded a formal statement, sharp, lucid, devastating in its detail, outlining every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every stolen dollar Yi-jin had funneled out of her accounts under the guise of caring for a dying woman nobody in the family had bothered to actually look after. She named Ji-sun's involvement without flinching, watching her own granddaughter's photograph on the nightstand as she did it, tears sliding silently down a face that had not allowed itself to cry in front of anyone in years. "I loved that girl since she was born," Sunja whispered when the recording finished. "And she watched me suffer and saw only numbers." By dawn, Yi-jin's threats had collapsed entirely under the weight of documented, notarized truth. Faced with fraud charges that would not simply disappear with the family's money, and confronted by a Taemin whose fury was now aimed squarely and permanently at her, Yi-jin fled the estate before security could formally detain her, disappearing into the city with whatever she could carry, never to be seen at the Khan residence again. Ji-sun's role, once exposed, fractured what remained of the family's public image, and Taemin, standing at the center of the wreckage, made the decision that would ultimately end the schemes for good. Full financial guardianship transferred not to any relative circling for inheritance, but to an independent trust overseen by his mother's own chosen attorney, with every account, every transaction, every future decision requiring Sunja's full, informed, unmanipulated consent for as long as she lived. Comment justice if you felt that in your chest, because the story isn't over yet, and what Sunja does next, in the quiet weeks that follow, will leave you in absolute tears. In the weeks after Yi-jin's disappearance and Ji-sun's quiet, disgraced retreat from the estate, something in the Khan household began, slowly and unevenly, to heal. Sunja's illness had not paused for any of this. The cancer continued its slow, merciless work regardless of the justice finally served, but something in her spirit had lifted, as though simply being believed, simply being protected, had given her a kind of peace medicine alone never could. She spent her mornings now with the curtains open, sunlight pouring across sheets Amara changed with gentle hands, and her afternoons telling stories from her youth that Taemin, for the first time in over a decade, sat and listened to without a phone in his hand or a meeting pulling him away. It was during one of those afternoons, with autumn light slanting gold across the room, that Sunja told a story neither Amara nor Taemin had ever heard before, the story of a young widow, decades ago, arriving in Houston, Texas of all places, on a work visa sponsored by a shipping company that no longer exists, pregnant with a son she would raise alone for 2 years before finally saving enough to return to Korea and build the empire that would one day bear her family's name. She spoke of a church community that had taken her in during those 2 desperate years, a congregation of mostly black families in a small Houston neighborhood who had fed her, clothed her infant son, and asked for nothing in return but her presence at Sunday service. "There was a woman there," Sunja said, her eyes distant with memory, "who used to bring me groceries every week without ever making me feel like charity. She had a young daughter, maybe 5 or 6 years old at the time, always laughing, always underfoot. I never forgot that woman's kindness. I named it in my will, decades later, still trying to repay a debt I never found a way to settle. A scholarship fund, established anonymously, for a small church community outside Houston." Amara's hands went still on the water glass she was refilling. "What was the neighborhood?" she asked, her voice suddenly unsteady. "What was the church?" Sunja told her, and the room went silent in a way that felt like the whole house was holding its breath. It was Amara's own childhood church. The woman Sunja had just described, down to the laughing little girl underfoot, was Amara's own grandmother, and the daughter she remembered was Amara's own mother. Tears filled Amara's eyes before she could stop them. "That scholarship fund," she whispered. "My mother received money from that fund to finish nursing school. I never knew where it came from. Nobody ever knew where it came from." Sunja reached for Amara's hand, her own eyes glistening, disbelief and something like wonder passing across her tired face. "The universe," the old woman said softly, "has a strange, beautiful sense of humor, child. I spent 30 years trying to repay a kindness I could never quite locate again, and now here you are, standing in my room, having given me back everything that family once gave me, without either of us knowing the debt already existed between us." Nobody in that room could speak for a long moment. Taemin, standing quietly by the window, looked at Amara with an expression that had nothing left of the cold, guarded stranger who had once demanded to know what she was doing in his mother's room at midnight. What remained was simply a man who had watched, over months, a woman choose kindness in a house that punished it, choose truth in a family built on lies, and now discovered that the threads connecting her to his mother stretched back further than any of them could have imagined. "I think," he said quietly, "my mother has been waiting 30 years to meet you properly. If this twist just took your breath away, you are not imagining it, because the story isn't finished, and the ending waiting for this family will make you believe, just a little more, in the strange mercy of the world." Sunja did not live to see winter. She passed peacefully on a quiet November morning, sunlight pouring through the curtains. Amara had learned, months earlier, to always keep open, with her son holding one hand and the woman who had become like a granddaughter to her holding the other. Her final words, spoken so softly that only Amara caught them clearly, were simple. "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered, when everyone else had already decided I was gone. The funeral drew hundreds, business partners, distant relatives suddenly rediscovering affection now that scandal had cleared the air, employees who had worked for the family for decades. But it was the small, quiet moment afterward, in the study where Sunja's will was formally read, that mattered most. Alongside the expected provisions for the company and its holdings, Sunja had added a final clause, written and notarized in her own clear hand only weeks before she passed, a trust established in Amara's name, not as payment for services rendered, the document specified, but as long overdue repayment of a debt her own family owed, a kindness shown to a frightened young widow and her infant son, decades earlier, by a church community in Houston, Texas, that never asked for anything in return. Amara wept reading those words, not for the money, though it would change her family's life in ways she hadn't dared to dream, but for the simple, staggering fact that she had been seen, truly seen, the way she had once seen a dying woman nobody else had bothered to look at twice. In the months that followed, the Khan household transformed into something unrecognizable from the cold, fear-driven estate Amara had first walked into. Taemin, freed in some quiet, unspoken way from the armor his mother's decline had forced him to wear, began spending his evenings not behind his desk but in the garden his mother had loved, often with Amara beside him, the silence between them comfortable now instead of guarded. What began as gratitude slowly, carefully, became something neither of them rushed to name, built not on the desperate urgency of danger they'd survived together, but on the steady, patient foundation of two people who had chosen honesty when it would have been easier to choose fear. He asked her, one evening months later, standing in the same garden his mother used to sit in every morning before the illness took her strength, whether she might consider staying in Korea, not as staff, not as anyone's employee, but simply as herself, for as long as she wanted to remain. Amara, looking at a man who had once terrified an entire underworld and now stood before her with nothing but quiet vulnerability in his eyes, found that the answer had been forming in her heart for longer than she'd admitted, even to herself. "I came to this house," she told him, "because I needed a job and I had nowhere else to turn. I'm staying because somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like someone else's house, and started feeling like it might, someday, feel like home." The story of the maid who stood up to Korea's most feared family and uncovered a debt 3 decades old spread quietly through Incheon in the months that followed, whispered in kitchens and boardrooms alike, not as gossip, but as something closer to legend. People spoke of Kang Sunja not as the cold matriarch her illness had made her appear in her final years, but as a woman who, even while dying forgotten in the back room of her own house, had somehow still found the strength to make things right. And they spoke of Amara, the maid from Houston who arrived with $90 and a fading visa, who chose compassion in a house built on fear, and who, in the end, found herself woven into a family's history long before she ever knew it. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us to tell it, make sure you're subscribed, Because stories like this, the ones about kindness quietly changing everything, are exactly what this channel is built on. Drop a comment and tell us which part broke your heart the most. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that goodness still matters, and we'll see you in the next story.